If you're just starting to learn Lightroom Classic, then this is the video for you, because today I'm going to be showing you a step-by-step process that you can use to edit your wildlife photography images. And we're going to be doing this by editing this photo right here of a grey seal that I took down in Norfolk. A link to this photo will be available in the description down below should you want to download it and follow along. When we're editing photos, we want to start by using our broadest adjustments and work our way down into more fine details. The first thing we want to do is make sure that lens corrections are turned on. So if we scroll down, you'll see this box right here, which is aptly titled Lens Corrections, and it's just a question of ticking both Enable Profile Corrections and removing chromatic aberration. Now, Adobe generally does a good job in identifying which lens has been used, but perhaps you might need to change it. So just clicking on any of the makes or models, and you can usually find most lenses from there. So once that's done, the next thing I want to do is I want to crop my photo. So if we come up to this tool up here, this is the crop overlay. And for this photo, what I'd like to do is to try and make my subject larger. So we're going to crop quite heavily. So I'm going to use the crop tool and bring this in just like this. And down again, just like this. Now you can see this top little window, the little preview, but also using these grid lines is also going to be a really useful way of seeing how your photo is going to look. Now, some people are quite against cropping. I find that often in wildlife photography it's generally necessary, and it's really only on unique occasions that I'm going to print my photos quite large, like this one up at the back. So with our cropping done, we can close the cropping tool and we end up with our photo looking more like this. So next we want to move on to our basic adjustments. So if we go up here into our basics panel, you'll see the various sliders that we have available. So the first one we're going to deal with is exposure. So exposure is going to be involved with the general brightness of our image. Pushing it to the right, we end up with a very bright image, and pushing it to the left, we end up with a very dark image. And both of these are going to reflect the mood of our photograph. In this example, we've got a very playful looking animal, and as such, we want to make our image quite bright. But how far can we push it until it becomes too bright and we start to lose detail? So for that, what we want to do is look at the histogram, which can be found up at the top up here. And this is a visual representation of how bright our photograph is. So as you see, when we move our slider to the right, we start to get a brighter image, and as such the graph moves to the right. The other thing you'll notice is this little yellow triangle. Now what this shows is that some of our image is too bright. In fact, when we hover over it, you'll see that now on our image, it's highlighted some areas in red. These are places where effectively all the detail has been lost. Now we can reclaim a little bit of this back using some of the sliders that I'm going to show you later. So for now, I'm going to leave it like this, where we have a little bit of our highlights clipped. Working our way down, the next slider is contrast. And as the name suggests, this does add contrast to our image. Pushing it to the left, we end up with quite a washed out looking image, whereas pushing it to the right, we'll end up with a much kind of crunchier looking image. I often find for wildlife, it's not a great idea to go above 10, either into the positive or into the negative for this slider. So for now, I'm going to leave it at +5, adding a little bit of contrast to our image, but not too much. One of the reasons I don't like to push this too far is because it's globally adjusting the contrast, whereas we can use our other sliders to more finely adjust this. The first one is highlights, and this is the slider that's going to help us to reclaim some of that detail that we lost raising our exposure. Now what we could do is look at our histogram and see when our triangle loses its colour. Alternatively, what you can do is press J. So in pressing J, you get two different colours appear. So the red colours are where things are too bright and the image has been clipped. So if we bring down our highlights, you'll see some of that colour disappears. Just like that. So I'm actually going to leave a little bit clipped, and personally I think this is fine. If you think about it, within prints you have black colours and you have white colours. I think it's perfectly fine to have a little bit of the extremes of both. The other colour you're going to notice is there's blue. So if you look at the nostrils, you get this blue colour. So this is essentially where things are jet black, and as such you've lost a little bit of detail. So if you wanted to reclaim the details within the shadows, you would just raise this slider up, and then you've reclaimed the details. In this case in the nostrils, so it's probably not the most important thing in the world. So in this case, the more important thing is how the shadows look globally. So for me, I actually want more contrast in our image, so I don't mind losing the details within the nostril or in the eye. And I actually want to bring our shadows down slightly. So we've actually ended up with a more contrasty looking image. So moving on to our whites, this is the extreme end of the highlights. So as you see, when we move around the slider, Again, we can either brighten up our image or darken it down. And for me, in this case, I like it a little bit up because we want a nice bright looking photograph. And it's the same case with the black slider, which is essentially the more extreme end of our shadows. So in this case, I only want to bring it down slightly, let's say about -4. So if we have a look at our image so far, you'll see it's much brighter. We've been able to recover a lot of the details within the shadows and the face. So next I like to move on to the details. So what we want to do here is we want to zoom into 100%, and we want to look at somewhere that's quite detailed on our image. So looking around the whiskers, around the eyes as well. In terms of details, there are 2 sliders that are going to really help us here. The first is texture. So moving that to the right, we get a little bit more detail back in our photo. You don't want to push this too hard because it doesn't look very natural, but I find maybe 10 or 20 as your sort of limit here. And this is even more so the case with clarity, where I find when you push it too far, it looks very unnatural very, very quickly. That looks absolutely terrible. So let's bring that down and go to about, let's say 7 and 9 for our 2 sliders here. Zooming back out because I want to look at dehaze now, so I can't really see a lot of haze that I want removing here. Might move that slightly up, but yeah, nothing really major that I want to remove, so let's leave that. So let's leave that quite low. So moving on to our next sliders, this is Vibrance and Saturation. Now saturation will generally work across the image, and you'll see in this case by raising it, you do get lovely colours within the blues at the background and a little bit within the sand, but we've got a bit of this kind of weird, but we've got a little bit of this weird sort of yellow tone coming in here. I'm actually going to leave the saturation how it is now because we're going to fix that, but it's just something to note for now that we've ended up with got a weird colour. Vibrance as well, we can push that up slightly, but let's not go too high with either of these sliders in this case. We want a nice kind of fun looking photo. So a little bit of saturation and a little bit of vibrance is going to give us that sort of fun, sort of Skittles look almost, but we don't want to push it too far because it's going to look quite fake, and we don't generally want to bring it down because it's going to flatten our image too. So you'll see when I push it too far, everything's got jaundice and it looks absolutely terrible, but it shows you where all the colours are, I guess. And bring it down, you end up with a black and white noir movie. Again, a good rule of thumb would be about 20 for both of these sliders. Right, so moving down the page, we get our color mixer. This will show us the hue, saturation and luminance of individual colors. And this is where we're going to fix our yellows. So let's start with that, shall we? So we go into our yellows. This yellow looks too more like Kid Sick yellow. So I want to move this towards the sort of orange color, which is a bit warmer and a bit nicer. So I'm going to move this slider to the left. And we get a nice warm looking color right there. We can also move our oranges as well, which looks great right there. And we have a nice blue sea behind our subject. However, it's quite a dark blue, and what I'd like to try and achieve in this photo is a pastel-y blue. So we're going to move some of our blues as well, shall we? So let's take blue, move that slightly this way. The other one I'm going to move is aqua, and move that down. Let's say about there. Okay. Now the 2 primary colours within this photo are blue and yellow, but obviously you can move any one of these sliders and adjust the hues of them accordingly. Let's look at the individual saturations of each one of these colours. Let's start with the oranges, shall we? And we want to bring that down slightly, I think. Only a tad, but just down a little bit. Yellows we definitely want to bring down, and again only slight increments each time. And our aquas we want to bring up slightly, and our blues, and we want to bring our blues up a little bit as well. And finally, luminance. So this is essentially the brightness of each one of these values. So for this photo, if we bring our oranges down slightly and our yellows down slightly, we get that lovely golden sand. And we'll bring our blues up and our aquas up as well. So we've got a nice bright background. Okay. So let's have a look how far we've come so far. So you'll see how much more our colours are now popping, as well as the overall exposure of our photograph. So as we continue to move down the page, we come towards colour grading, which is these 3 RGB circles right here. Personally, I like to start with my shadows. So we're going to move that circle out slightly to give it a little bit of saturation. Then I come and grab this coloured circle because we don't want magenta looking shadows. And I like to bring that down, often generally bringing that cooler. So into one of these blue tones is what I like to do. And you'll see what that's done is we've added just a little bit of blue tones into the shadow regions. So if I use this icon right here, it shows you the difference between the before and the after. So just taking away a little bit of that temperature from the shadows. Then we're going to move on to our highlights. So if we bring that up, again, moving that circle away from the middle gives it a little bit of saturation. It shows you how much it's going to be influenced by the relative grade. And for this, I want to try and bring in a nice warm tone. So we're going to move into our orange. You could also move the midtones as well if you wanted to, either bringing it cool or into the hot. And for this photo, I feel that I quite like, I quite like the look of the warm in this case. And you'll see this made quite a large difference to our photo if we look at the before and we look at the after effects of having our color grading. Now this is often the place that beginners will stop, but I feel like you're missing out on an incredibly powerful tool by doing so. What we're going to talk about next is masking. So what you want to do in Lightroom in order to create masks is to come up to this icon up here. This gives you lots of different options and Lightroom makes it incredibly easy to do. The 2 masks that I would recommend starting with are subject masks and background masks. This is because by using both of these masks, we're able to separate our subject from the background and make our photos really pop. So let's start by selecting our subject. So by selecting our subject, you'll see that Lightroom has drawn an outline of where it thinks our subject is and it has masked it as such. And in this case, it's done a really great job. If for any reason that it's added too much or it's taken away too much from our subject, what you can do is to come up to this little plus icon, come down to brush, and you can add in stuff like this. But obviously we're not going to do that. And the opposite is true if you want to take anything away. So if we press minus and come down to brush, then we can tidy bits up. So let's say this little bit underneath the tail here, I don't want, and you can take it away just like that. Okay, so generally what we want to do when we want to make our subject pop is we want to raise the exposure slightly. Now for this technique, I'd recommend not going above 0.2. Now this is because you risk blowing out those highlights. We can also create a bigger difference in exposure between our subject and our background by dropping down the exposure of our background, which we're going to do shortly. So if we raise this and we go up to 0.2, you'll see what Lightroom has done is it's raised the exposure of just our subject. So now it kind of stands out slightly more from our background without looking too unnatural. We can also adjust any of the other sliders if I want to add more contrast to it. Let's say I do want to add just a slight bit of contrast to our subject, and we want to bring those highlights down just to make sure we're not clipping anything as well. Let's bring the shadows down a tiny bit, and I'm pretty happy with the red. So what I want to do now is I want to go and select my background. So this is going to select, and what this is going to do is Lightroom is going to calculate everything that's not our subject. So it's effectively going to make the inverse of what we've just done. So there you go. We've selected everything that's not a seal, and we're going to do exactly the opposite. So we're going to bring our exposure down, again, not more than 0.2. And that darkens our background slightly so our subject is standing out that little bit more. I can actually remove some of this contrast as well. So if I raise it in the subject, I generally want to remove it within the background. And that helps to create a slight bit more contrast between our foreground and our background. So I'm going to raise the highlights slightly because I quite like the detail that we get in the highlights in our waves in the background. I'm going to raise my shadows slightly because again, I want to remove some of the contrast in the background. And I think that's all I'm going to do in terms of basic adjustments in the background. What you can also do is to come down into details and you can remove some of the clarity and the dehaze from the background. So that just makes the background slightly blurrier. So let's bring the clarity down, let's bring the dehaze down, and that adds just a little bit of haze into the background so our subject stands out slightly more. Again, not going to push it too hard, so -7 and -7 for both clarity and dehaze. And so far we've only really scratched the surface of what's possible to do with masks. And in future videos we'll explore what other things that you can do with masks, so make sure you're subscribed for that. So the final step we want to do now is we want to denoise our image. Even though this was taken at quite a low ISO, so ISO 1600, but we've done quite a lot to our image, and in raising our exposures we're going to introduce lots of noise to our image. And if we zoom in really close, you're able to see this in the details. So you'll see just how much noise is around our seal, and we've lost some of the detail within the eyes. So what we want to do is we want to come into our adjustments panel, and we want to come down all the way down into detail, which is this one here, and then noise reduction. So you've got denoise here. You could do this manually, but frankly I find that the AI denoise now in Lightroom is fantastic, so we're going to let Lightroom do the hard work. So if I come up here, and we go, and what we want to do is we want to look at an area where there's lots of detail. So the whiskers here is fantastic. What I like to do is I like to start at 50, and by pressing here you can see the difference before and the after. You'll see that it's removed a lot of the color noise, however it still looks quite pixely, so I think we can push that slightly higher. Let's see what sort of 65 looks like. And you'll see that does look a little bit better. You don't want to push this too far, because let's say if we go to 100, then it starts to really break down and you get a very soft looking image. If we look at, say, the eye, then the eye is probably going to look a little bit rubbish once it's rendered. So yeah, looking at the before and the after, it has removed the noise, but it looks very like soft and glossy. So you don't want to go too high, so I'm going to bring that down, and I'm quite happy at about 65. So let's go for about that. You'll see just how much detail has been able to be retained now, and we've lost all the color noise. So let's set that to enhance, let that run, and I'm going to speed it up in post, but generally Lightroom is quite quick now. It's definitely getting faster and faster and faster. It's probably not going to be too fast because I'm also video recording at the same time, but hopefully for you it's a little bit faster. So there we go, it's done, and you'll see how much detail has been retained, and we've been able to lose all of that color noise. I'm quite happy with that. Really hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll catch you at the next one.